You were told rule of law was restored. What actually returned was predictability, and the fact that its absence had become valuable to specific actors tells you everything about what broke the crisis. Wasn't injustice. It was that enforcement discretion itself had become a tradable asset. The official narrative is straightforward. Between 2021 and 2025, the U.S. Department of Justice operated under extraordinary pressure. Threats to democratic norms required extraordinary responses. Investigations were opened, prosecutorial resources deployed, and institutional guardrails defended. By January 2025, a new administration claimed those guardrails had bent too far and promised restoration, a return to neutral enforcement, apolitical prosecution, and institutional restraint. This framing sounds logical. Democracies do face stress. Institutions must respond. And when circumstances normalize, corrections happen. That is how systems are supposed to self-regulate. But there is a question embedded in that narrative that rarely gets asked: if the system corrected itself, why did correction require mass personnel terminations, the exposure of sealed surveillance orders, and a formal year-end accountability statement from the DOJ itself? Institutions that function properly do not need to announce their own rehabilitation. Markets that price risk accurately do not experience sudden credibility collapses. The public explanation treats this as a policy dispute. Different administrations with different enforcement philosophies. That is plausible on the surface, but it ignores the structural incentives that made selective enforcement not just possible but profitable. Enforcement discretion is not neutral. It is a resource, and like any resource, it can be allocated in ways that benefit those who control it. In a functioning legal system, prosecutorial discretion exists to prioritize limited resources, pursue violent crime over petty theft, financial fraud over regulatory paperwork violations. The discretion is a tool for efficiency, not advantage. But when enforcement becomes predictably asymmetric, when similar conduct by different actors produces different outcomes, discretion stops being a tool. It becomes leverage. Consider the pattern between 2017 and 2020. Objections to electoral certification were filed by Democratic lawmakers, citing foreign interference claims later discredited. No prosecutions followed between 2021 and 2024. Objections by Republican lawmakers to electoral certification triggered the largest federal investigation in U.S. history, with over 1,000 arrests and surveillance extending into congressional offices. The conduct was legally identical. The outcome was not. This is not a moral claim. It is a structural observation. When identical behavior is treated differently, based on the actor's alignment, enforcement discretion has been transformed into a positional advantage, and positional advantages create incentives for actors to secure access to enforcement discretion, not to avoid its scrutiny. That is the inversion. The goal is no longer to stay within the law. The goal is to ensure you are on the side that decides when the law applies. This dynamic mirrors what we see in captured regulatory environments, where the goal of market participants is not compliance, but influence over the regulator. Financial institutions do not merely follow capital requirements. They lobby to define what counts as capital. Energy firms do not merely reduce emissions. They negotiate which emissions get measured. And in a prosecutorial environment, where discretion has been asymmetrically applied, political actors do not merely avoid illegality. They position themselves to control its definition. The positioning has measurable value. Consider between 2021 and 2024, federal investigations into parental protests at school board meetings, Catholic religious groups, and pro-life activists consume thousands of FBI agent hours. Meanwhile, over 300 attacks on pregnancy resource centers went largely uninvestigated. With arrest rates below 2%, the attacks were not ambiguous. They were public organized and included arson. But enforcement resources moved elsewhere. The question is not whether this represents injustice. That is a moral frame. The question is what incentive structure made this allocation rational. For the actors involved, the answer is career advancement. Prosecutors and agents do not operate in a vacuum. They respond to signals from leadership, about which cases generate institutional approval. Between 2021 and 2024, cases involving politically aligned targets generated promotions, media visibility, and institutional support. Cases involving non-aligned targets generated scrutiny, resource constraints, and internal friction. This is not unique to the United States. The UK's handling of grooming, gang prosecutions followed a similar logic. Cases that aligned with institutional narratives received resources. Cases that contradicted them faced delays, suppression, or reframing. Canada's invocation of the Emergencies Act to freeze bank accounts of protest donors created a financial enforcement precedent that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with leverage. What ties these examples together is the transformation of enforcement from a rule-bound process into a discretionary tool used to impose costs on disfavored actors while shielding favored ones. Once that transformation occurs, the system is no longer predictable, and unpredictability is poison for anyone trying to operate within it. Prosecutorial arbitrage functions like any other form of regulatory capture, but with a critical difference. It operates through negative selection rather than positive incentives. In classic regulatory capture, industry players offer regulators post-government employment, funding, or status in exchange for favorable rules. The regulator benefits directly. In prosecutorial arbitrage, the benefit is indirect. Career advancement comes not from what you permit, but from whom you target. This creates a market for enforcement discretion, with three key characteristics. First, asymmetric cost imposition. Legal defense is expensive. The average federal white-collar defense cost between $50,000 and $500,000 before trial for complex investigations involving multiple defendants. That figure exceeds $2 million even if charges are ultimately dropped. The reputational and financial damage is irreversible. This means the decision to investigate is itself a sanction, one that requires no conviction to impose costs. Second, opacity of decision criteria. Prosecutorial discretion is almost entirely unreviewable. Grand jury secrecy rules prevent disclosure of investigative rationale. Declination decisions, choices not to prosecute, are not subject to appeal. This means there is no mechanism to force consistency. Enforcement patterns can shift entirely based on leadership priorities, without any formal policy change. Third-time value asymmetry. Investigations move slowly, the average. Federal investigation takes 18 to 24 months before charges are filed. Appeals take years. This creates a temporal mismatch. Political actors benefit from announcing investigations immediately, but face no consequences if those investigations collapse years later. By the time a case is dismissed, the political value has already been extracted. These three features make prosecutorial discretion a uniquely valuable asset in political competition. You can impose costs on opponents without proving wrongdoing. You can do so without transparent criteria, and you can extract political value long before legal resolution. The mechanics are not hidden. In 2022, the FBI's Richmond Field Office memo, categorizing radical traditionalist Catholics as potential extremists, was leaked. The memo recommended developing sources inside churches, not because of specific threats, but because of theological positions. That is not law enforcement. That is ideological mapping disguised as counterterrorism. Similarly, Operation Arctic Frost, aimed at individuals involved in election objections, included subpoena requests for sitting senators' communications. Those requests were sealed by judicial order, preventing public disclosure until after the 2024 election. The justification was preventing evidence destruction, but the practical effect was shielding executive branch, surveillance of the legislative branch, from democratic accountability. This is not about whether surveillance was legally authorized. It is about whether the structure of authorization itself prevents abuse. When judges can seal orders that prevent legislative oversight, and when those orders remain sealed until political circumstances change, the system has created an accountability gap that clever actors will exploit. The result is what economists call an unhedgeable risk, a condition where no amount of compliance guarantees protection, because the criteria for exposure are not transparent or consistent. Businesses face this in authoritarian states. They now face it in G7 democracies. Unhedgeable institutional risk has measurable effects. Capital allocation shifts when businesses cannot predict enforcement. They avoid regulated sectors or build political insurance through lobbying. U.S. corporate lobbying expenditures increased 22% between 2020 and 2023, reaching $4.1 billion annually. That money is not buying favorable legislation. It is buying protection from discretionary enforcement. Institutional arbitrage accelerates. Firms increasingly route activities through jurisdictions. with clearer rules even if those rules are more restrictive. Switzerland, Singapore, and the UAE saw combined foreign direct investment inflows rise 34% between 2021 and 2023, while U.S. FDI inflows stagnated. Predictability is more valuable than flexibility. When flexibility means exposure, talent exits accelerate high-risk roles, compliance legal, government affairs see wage premiums but higher turnover.